I was sitting on a cold plastic chair outside the intensive care unit when my son's wife walked through the double doors. Her husband of 10 years had just been pronounced dead from a massive sudden heart attack at the age of 42. A normal widow would be weeping broken, unable to stand. But Monica walked up to me, her designer heels clicking sharply on the linoleum, not a single hair out of place. Her mascara was perfectly intact. She leaned down so her face was inches from mine completely, ignoring my tears, and whispered, "Do not expect a single penny of Colin's $50 million estate, Richard. It is all mine. Leave right now before I have security escort you out of the building." If you are just finding this story, take a deep breath, because what I discovered in the hours after my son's death changed everything I thought I knew about the woman he married. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for weakness, hit the like button right now. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. It helps me know who is listening to this old engineer. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years as a chief structural engineer building bridges and corporate high-rises across the country. I am a man who understands how things are put together, how pressure points work, and how structures collapse. I retired a few years ago to live a quiet life here in Charlotte, North Carolina. My son Colin was my pride and joy. He took my engineering mind and applied it to software, building a logistics tech company that exploded in value. $50 million, the financial analysts said. He was brilliant, generous, and completely dedicated to his work. But he had always been blind when it came to Monica. The fluorescent lights overhead in that hospital corridor buzzed with a low, irritating frequency. I had been sitting in that waiting area for 4 excruciating hours. 4 hours of watching doctors rush in and out, listening to the agonizing, frantic beep of medical monitors. Colin was a runner. He ate well, avoided smoking, and had regular checkups. A massive, catastrophic heart attack at 42 made absolutely no medical sense. When they finally turned off the machines and a doctor gave me the slow, grim shake of his head, a part of my soul died with him. I felt numb, heavy, staring at my calloused hands that had drafted blueprints for massive steel structures but were entirely useless to save my only child. Then Monica emerged from the private consultation room. I looked up, expecting to see a woman shattered by grief looking for a shoulder to cry on. Instead, I saw a predator who had just finished a very satisfying meal. She adjusted the cuffs of her pristine white blazer. There were no trembling hands. There were no red, puffy eyes. Her makeup was not just flawless, it was freshly applied. She had actually taken the time while her husband was dying on a table to touch up her lipstick and powder her nose in the hospital bathroom. She walked toward me with a chilling sense of purpose. "Colin is gone," she stated flatly. "Not passed away, not left us. Gone," as if she were reporting a misplaced package. I stood up slowly, my joints aching, trying to find words of comfort for her, despite our differences. "Monica, I am so—" I started, but she cut me off, stepping directly into my personal space. The smell of her expensive floral perfume was nauseating in that sterile hallway. That is when she delivered the words that still ring in my ears, warning me not to expect a penny, threatening me with security. Any other father might have screamed. Any other man might have caused a massive scene right there in the hallway of City General Hospital. But I did not. My engineering mind, trained to observe, calculate, and analyze under extreme pressure, immediately kicked in. I looked into her eyes. They were cold, dry, and terrifyingly triumphant. There was no sorrow. There was only calculation. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to look unstable, angry, and irrational, so she could justify calling the guards and painting me as the crazy father-in-law. So I gave her nothing. I simply nodded slowly, matching her cold stare, and stepped back. "I will see you at the funeral, Monica," I said quietly, my voice completely devoid of the crushing grief that was tearing my chest apart. She scoffed, clearly disappointed that I had not taken the bait, turned on her heel, and walked away down the long corridor without a single backward glance. I stood alone in the hallway, letting the heavy, suffocating silence wash over me. A few minutes later, a young, exhausted-looking nurse approached me. She had a kind, sympathetic face, her eyes filled with the genuine sorrow that my own daughter-in-law severely lacked. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked softly. I nodded. "I am so sorry for your loss. The doctors did everything they could." His heart simply stopped. She looked down at her clipboard, hesitating for a fraction of a second, as if she wanted to say something more, but then thought better of it. She handed me a clear plastic belongings bag. Inside were the clothes Colin had been wearing when the paramedics brought him in. His gray slacks, his blue dress shirt, his leather belt, and a few personal items from his pockets. "These are his things," she whispered. I took the bag, the thick plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet corridor. I thanked her, my voice barely above a whisper, and made my way out of the hospital. The automatic doors slid open, hitting me with a wall of thick, humid North Carolina heat. The blinding afternoon sun felt almost insulting on a day so incredibly dark. I walked across the massive asphalt parking lot to my old reliable sedan. I sat behind the steering wheel, pulling the door shut, locking out the noise of the city traffic. The reality of Colin's death finally crashed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I gripped the leather steering wheel, taking slow, measured breaths to keep my hands from shaking. I allowed myself exactly 2 minutes to weep for my boy. 2 minutes of blinding, agonizing pain. But my mind could not let go of Monica's face. The total absence of shock. The immediate aggressive pivot to the money. The fresh lipstick. It was wrong. It was fundamentally, structurally wrong. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the plastic bag of Colin's belongings. I opened the top, pulling out his leather wallet, his silver watch, and his keys. Colin was a man of strict routine, meticulous to a fault. He kept his life highly organized. As I sifted through his heavy keychain, something immediately caught my eye. Wedged tightly between his car key and his house key was a strange, unmarked brass key. It looked old, industrial, heavy, exactly like a high-security safe deposit key. Colin had never in all our weekly conversations mentioned opening a separate lockbox. I set the key on the dashboard and reached back into the bag. Tucked deep into the front pocket of his folded gray slacks was a small, crumpled piece of thermal paper. I carefully pulled it out and smoothed it over the center of the steering wheel. It was a highway toll receipt. The location printed clearly at the very top was Concord, a small town about 30 miles north of Charlotte. I looked at the timestamp. It was from 7:30 this morning, just 2 hours before Colin collapsed in his downtown corporate office. I stared at the receipt, my heart hammering against my ribs. Why was my son driving to Concord in a frantic rush, carrying a hidden brass key on the very morning his perfectly healthy heart supposedly gave out? My direct engineering logic connected the dots that Monica's arrogance had overlooked. People who are planning to die of natural causes do not make secret, panicked trips out of town at dawn. A cold, terrifying realization began to form in my chest, pushing the grief aside and replacing it with a lethal focus. My son did not just die. He was silenced, and the woman who just threatened me in the hospital hallway knew exactly why. 3 days later, the Charlotte sky was a heavy, suffocating gray. I stood at the entrance of the largest, most ostentatious cathedral in the city center. It did not feel like a place of mourning. It felt like a corporate retreat. The massive oak doors were propped open, and the vestibule was packed with people who looked more interested in exchanging business cards than offering sincere condolences. Colin had built a logistics empire from the ground up, and this crowd was a sea of tailored suits, expensive watches, and opportunistic smiles. I walked down the long center aisle, my posture straight, my face set in stone. I was the father of the deceased, the man who had taught Colin how to build his first circuit board at the kitchen table when he was just 10 years old. Yet when I reached the front pews, a young usher with a discreet earpiece stepped directly into my path. He checked a laminated seating chart on his clipboard and pointed me toward the 4th row. Not the first row with the grieving family. The 4th row wedged firmly between mid-level regional managers and distant corporate acquaintances. I did not argue. I simply took my assigned seat and observed. That was my element anyway. Engineering is the absolute science of observing structural flaws before they collapse. Monica had orchestrated every single detail of this event. She floated near the front of the altar draped in a perfectly tailored black dress that looked more suited for a high-fashion runway than a solemn funeral. She was greeting the board members and key investors of Colin's tech company. I watched as she gracefully accepted their sympathies, dabbing her dry eyes with a delicate black lace handkerchief. She was playing the role of the devastated widow with terrifying precision, but I heard the quiet whispers around me. Monica had been very busy planting seeds over the last few days. A man in the row behind me leaned over to his colleague and muttered about how tragic it was that Colin had to deal with an estranged, senile father in his final months. He said Monica was an absolute saint for putting up with my supposed mental decline and unpredictable behavior. The narrative was already written and distributed to the entire city. I was the out-of-touch, aging relic who belonged in a home. She was the brilliant, suffering wife holding the massive corporate empire together through a tragedy. The service began with a booming organ and a long procession of corporate executives. I kept my eyes fixed on the polished mahogany casket at the front of the room. My boy was in there. The pain in my chest was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that threatened to break my ribs and bring me to my knees. But I locked that grief away in a dark, quiet corner of my mind. Grief would make me weak, and I could not afford to be weak today. When Monica stepped up to the large marble podium to deliver the eulogy, a deep hush fell over the massive room. She adjusted the microphone, letting out a soft, rehearsed sigh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She spoke about Colin with a trembling, melodic voice. She painted a vivid picture of a man who worked himself into an early grave driven solely by the extreme stress of managing a $50 million tech company. She told the silent crowd how he had been losing sleep, how his heart had simply given out under the massive pressure of his own unrelenting ambition. It was a beautiful, entirely plausible lie. She spoke of his grand vision, his lasting legacy, and how she promised to carry the company forward in his honor, taking the heavy burden onto her own shoulders. The crowd was completely captivated. Women wiped away quiet tears. Men nodded in solemn, profound respect. It was an Oscar-worthy performance designed to solidify her power. But my eyes were not on the weeping audience. I was watching the specific people she made direct eye contact with during her speech. Specifically, one man sitting in the front row, Trent Harrison. He was the chief financial officer of Colin's company, a 30-something executive with slicked-back hair and the kind of expensive, flashy suit that my son always hated. Right as Monica delivered her final tearful promise to protect the company's financial future, her gaze locked directly onto Trent. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the grieving widow completely slipped. A subtle, triumphant smirk pulled at the corner of her perfectly painted lips. Trent returned the dark look with a barely perceptible nod of his head. It was not a look of shared mourning or profound loss. It was the look of two business partners who had just successfully executed a hostile merger. The service concluded with a standing ovation, an absurd and offensive gesture for a funeral, but fitting for the corporate spectacle Monica had carefully designed. As the massive crowd began to filter out toward the grand reception hall, I remained in my seat. I let the sea of dark suits flow past me, waiting patiently for the room to clear. I needed to move without being noticed. Being placed in the fourth row, dismissed by everyone as a clueless old man, was actually my greatest advantage. No one pays attention to the forgotten elderly relative. I slowly made my way toward the side corridors of the cathedral, steering clear of the main reception, where the catered food and open bar were located. The thick, heavy stone walls muffled the loud sound of the networking crowd. I walked down a narrow, dimly lit hallway that led to the private preparation rooms used by the church staff. I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard the sharp, distinct click of Monica's designer heels echoing from around the corner, followed closely by the low, urgent voice of a man. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, holding my breath, stepping deep into the dark shadow of a large marble pillar. It was Trent Harrison. He sounded incredibly anxious, his voice dropping to an intense, harsh whisper that carried down the quiet hall. "The board is eating it up," Trent said, his leather shoes pacing slightly on the tile. "The transition of power is going to be completely seamless, but we have a major loose end. Did you wipe his private server like I told you? We need it gone tonight." Monica let out a loud, annoyed sigh. "Relax, Trent. Everything is under control. The server is completely offline." "It is not enough for it to be offline, Monica." Trent snapped back, his tone sharp with genuine unhidden panic. "If anyone gets access to those encrypted logs, we are both going to federal prison for a very long time. You know exactly what is on that drive. We need it wiped completely clean before the old man starts asking questions." He was staring right at us during the eulogy. "Richard." Monica laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that chilled my blood. "Richard is a broken, senile old fool. He does not know how to turn on a modern computer, let alone decrypt a secure logistics server. He is probably wandering around the parking lot right now, forgetting where he parked his car. I will have the lawyer deal with him by Friday and push him out for good. Just focus on the shareholder meeting. Just make sure that server is scrubbed," Trent insisted, his voice trembling slightly. "I am not taking the fall for this." I stood completely frozen in the shadows, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. The scattered pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying speed. The unmarked brass safe deposit key hidden in Colin's pocket. The frantic toll receipt from Concord at dawn. The lethal smirk shared at the altar. And now a private server that held the key to a massive illegal cover-up. They truly thought I was just an outdated structural engineer. They thought I was a doddering old man, completely blinded by my own grief. They had absolutely no idea that I spent 40 years calculating the exact load-bearing capacity of massive steel frameworks and finding the precise structural weakness needed to bring them crashing down. I waited in the dark for the sound of their footsteps to fade down the hallway toward the grand reception. I did not confront them. I did not step out of the shadows to scream or demand answers for my son. That would be playing their foolish game. Instead, I turned around and walked silently out the side exit of the cathedral. The humid outdoor air hit my face, but I felt completely cold inside. My grief had crystallized into absolute, unwavering focus. Monica and Trent were rushing to erase the digital footprints of their deep betrayal, extremely confident that they had outsmarted a dying man. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had severely underestimated a father with nothing left to lose. As I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat, I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket. It glinted sharply in the gray afternoon light. A private server needed wiping. A lockbox sat waiting in Concord. The hunt had officially begun. 2 days later, my phone rang with a summons. It was not a polite request. It was an incredibly brisk clinical demand from a man named Derek, introducing himself as the lead partner at a boutique corporate law firm downtown. He claimed to be executing my son's affairs and insisted I appear at his office immediately. I put on my best dark suit, the exact same one I had worn to the funeral, and drove into the heart of the city. The traffic was heavy, mirroring the thick tension building inside my chest. Derek's office was located on the top floor of a sleek, newly constructed glass high-rise. Walking inside, I noticed how sterile it was. It was an overly air-conditioned space filled with modern, abstract art, stark white walls, and sharp metallic furniture. It lacked any warmth, any character, any trace of human empathy. It felt exactly like the kind of place where terrible, life-altering lies were packaged in expensive leather folders. When the young receptionist ushered me into the main conference room, Monica was already seated at the massive glass table. She looked remarkably relaxed, casually sipping sparkling water from a heavy crystal glass. Beside her sat Derek, a man in his late 30s, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and a practiced smile that seemed permanently plastered to his face. "Richard, thank you for coming on such short notice." Derek began, his voice slick and highly modulated. He slid a thick, bound stack of papers across the smooth glass surface toward me. We know this is an incredibly difficult time for the entire family. We are here to handle the transition of Colin's estate as smoothly and painlessly as possible. I sat down slowly, keeping my hands firmly folded in my lap. I did not look at the heavy stack of papers. I looked directly at Monica. She offered me a deep, sympathetic frown that failed to reach her cold eyes. "I am just trying to honor his final wishes, Richard," she murmured softly, playing the role of the devoted mourning widow to absolute perfection. Derek cleared his throat and tapped the pristine stack of papers with his manicured index finger. "As you may know, Colin updated his last will and testament very recently, specifically just 3 weeks ago." I felt a cold tightness forcefully grip my chest. Colin and I had sat down with my own attorney, Thomas Mitchell, 5 years ago to meticulously establish our respective trusts. Colin had been exceptionally clear and precise about his estate planning. A sudden, massive revision 3 weeks before a catastrophic heart attack was not just suspicious. It was glaringly impossible. "A revised will?" I asked, keeping my voice flat and completely unreadable. My son never mentioned a single word of this to me. Derek offered a patronizing, overly patient smile, leaning forward across the table, as if he were explaining a very simple concept to a slow child. Well, Richard's situations change rapidly in business. As Colin's logistics firm grew, so did his corporate responsibilities. The new will leaves the entirety of his assets, including his controlling shares in the tech company, the various real estate properties, and the liquid capital solely and exclusively to his wife, Monica. I slowly lowered my gaze to the document. My name was completely absent from the primary beneficiary list. According to these freshly printed pages, I had been systematically erased from my only son's legacy. "And what exact reason did he give for this sudden revision?" I asked. Monica let out a heavy, incredibly dramatic sigh. She reached across the wide table, pretending to reach for my hand, but I pulled it away before her fingers could make contact. She retracted her arm gracefully, entirely unfazed by the rejection. "Colin was under immense pressure, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with artificial syrupy sorrow. "The company was growing entirely too fast. He was losing his mind from the daily stress. He started having these terrible paranoid episodes. He became convinced that you were trying to usurp his board seat, that you secretly wanted to take over the tech firm." I stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her venomous lie wash over me. I was a retired structural engineer. I had absolutely zero interest in running a logistics tech company. Colin knew that better than anyone on earth. We had spent hours laughing on my back porch about how little I understood about his complex software algorithms. "He thought I was trying to steal his company," I repeated, my tone dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. "I am so sorry, Richard," Monica whispered, looking down at her perfectly manicured hands with feigned tragedy. He was not thinking clearly at the end. His brilliant mind was slipping away. "I am just trying to honor his final paranoid wishes. It is what he truly wanted." Derek seamlessly took over the conversation, sliding a second piece of paper across the table, followed closely by a sleek silver pen. "To avoid any lengthy, emotionally draining probate issues, Monica is prepared to be incredibly generous today. She is offering you a formal settlement." He placed a freshly printed bank check directly on top of the paper. $10,000, Richard. All you need to do is sign this simple waiver acknowledging the full validity of the revised will and permanently relinquishing any future claims against the estate. $10,000. My son had built a $50 million empire with his bare hands, and this woman was offering me an insulting $10,000 bribe to walk away and remain forever quiet. They were heavily banking on my grief. They expected me to be a shattered, confused old man who would eagerly take a small, pathetic payout just to avoid a complicated, drawn-out legal battle. They thought I would simply sign my name on the dotted line, hand over my son's entire life's work, and quietly fade into the background like a ghost. I looked down at the check. Then I looked at the legal waiver. My engineering mind instantly analyzed the structure of their trap. It was a classic ruthless pressure tactic. Hit the target when they are weak, offer a quick, painless escape, and secure the legal high ground before the victim has a chance to mentally recover. If I signed that paper right now, Monica and Trent Harrison would have absolute uncontested control over the company and whatever offshore accounts they were hiding. They would be completely immune to any future investigation. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Colin was not paranoid. Colin was not losing his mind from the stress of his work. Colin had discovered their massive financial bleeding. He had hidden a secure hard drive in a secret vault in Concord because he knew his own wife and his chief financial officer were actively trying to ruin him. And when my son got too close to exposing their massive theft, his perfectly healthy heart magically stopped beating. I slowly raised my hand and picked up the $10,000 check. Monica's eyes intensely tracked my movement, a glimmer of greedy anticipation flashing across her flawless face. She truly thought she had won. She firmly believed the old man was finally giving up and surrendering. I held the crisp, heavy paper between my fingers, feeling the heavy, suffocating silence hanging in the conference room. Then, with a smooth, deliberate motion, I tore the check directly down the middle. I carefully stacked the two halves, tore them again, and dropped the useless pieces onto the pristine glass table. Monica's jaw tightened instantly. Derek sat back in his expensive chair, his fake plastered smile completely vanishing from his face. "I will not be signing anything today," I said, my voice carrying the hard, unyielding weight of cold steel. I stood up from my chair, completely ignoring their shocked, angry expressions. Before I turned to walk out of the room, I deliberately leaned over the wide glass table, bringing my face very close to the so-called revised will. I needed to see it clearly for myself. I looked closely at the primary signature line on the final page of the document. My son had broken his wrist falling out of a large oak tree when he was 12 years old. The bone had healed slightly off-center despite the cast. Because of that old childhood injury, Colin could never properly write a perfectly straight horizontal line. Every single time he crossed the letter T in his name, his pen naturally flicked upward at a sharp, distinct angle. It was a very distinct, undeniable quirk of his handwriting that only a father who watched him write would know. I stared intensely at the dark blue ink pressed into the heavy paper. The name Colin Caldwell was written in bold, confident letters, but the cross on the TI was perfectly mechanically flat. There was absolutely no upward flick. There was no sign of his old familiar childhood injury. I straightened my posture, looking down at Monica. She was watching me closely, a faint, nervous shadow of uncertainty finally crossing her arrogant face. She had orchestrated a brilliant, ruthless corporate takeover, but she had missed a minor fatal structural detail. The signature on this will is a complete forgery. I did not say a single word to Monica or her slick attorney as I stood up from the glass table. I simply turned my back on them and walked out of that freezing office, leaving the torn pieces of their pathetic bribe scattered behind me. I took the elevator down to the underground parking garage in absolute silence, listening to the hollow echo of my own footsteps against the concrete. My mind was no longer clouded by the heavy, suffocating fog of fresh grief. That fog had been entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp clarity. Monica had forged my son's signature on a legally binding document, completely ignoring his childhood wrist injury that defined his handwriting. She had manufactured a paranoid delusion to justify cutting me out of his $50 million estate. She had successfully hijacked his funeral to secure her corporate power. And she had done it all while exchanging victorious smirks with the chief financial officer of his company. I drove through the bustling streets of downtown Charlotte, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a quiet, lethal intensity. The puzzle pieces were floating in the air, waiting for me to lock them into their precise structural positions, waiting for me to build a definitive case against her. The drive back to my modest single-story house on the quiet outskirts of the city felt entirely automatic. I parked in my narrow driveway, killed the engine, and just sat there in the fading evening light. This house was everything Monica despised. She had always pressured Colin to move me into a luxury high-rise, calling my neighborhood outdated and depressing. She could never understand why a man who had made a comfortable living designing corporate towers preferred the simple, grounded reality of a brick-and-mortar home with a front porch and a patch of green grass. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The silence in the house was profound, heavy with the undeniable absence of my son. Colin used to drop by every Sunday morning, bringing 2 black coffees and a box of warm pastries, sitting at my kitchen island, to talk about his week and his dreams. That routine was gone forever. I walked slowly down the hallway, shedding my dark suit jacket and tossing it over the back of a wooden dining chair, feeling the sudden drop in temperature inside the empty rooms. My joints ached with the deep physical exhaustion that only a grieving parent can truly understand, but I could not afford to rest. My engineering instincts were screaming at me, demanding that I analyze the structural flaws in Monica's perfect narrative. I walked into my kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The late afternoon shadows were stretching long and dark across the linoleum floor, making the empty house feel even more desolate. As I reached for a glass from the upper cabinet, my eyes fell on the small, cluttered desk tucked into the corner of the room. Sitting right next to a stack of sorted mail was my old, reliable landline telephone. It was an outdated, bulky answering machine with a physical microcassette tape, a device from a completely different era. Monica had mocked me endlessly for keeping it. She used to roll her eyes and tell Colin that I was hopelessly stuck in the past, entirely incapable of adapting to modern technology or understanding the digital world. She insisted that everyone used digital voicemails and mobile phones now. She was so incredibly confident in her own technological superiority that she completely ignored the absolute reliability of old physical hardware. There, in the dim light of my quiet kitchen, a small red light was blinking on the front of the machine. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. One blink. Pause. One blink. It indicated a single unheard message. I frowned, setting my empty water glass down on the counter. I rarely received calls on this number anymore, mostly just automated telemarketers or the occasional pharmacy reminder. It was a line I only gave out to doctors, utility companies, and my son. Colin was the only person who routinely called the landline, knowing I preferred the clear audio quality over a spotty cellular connection. I walked over to the desk, my heavy footsteps echoing in the silent house. I leaned over the machine and pressed the small button to check the caller identification and the digital timestamp. The green digital display lit up the dark corner of the kitchen. The call had been received on Tuesday morning at exactly 2 o'clock. I stared at those glowing green numbers, feeling a sudden drop in my stomach. It was the exact same night Colin had died. It was just 5 hours before he supposedly suffered a massive heart attack in his downtown office. A chill crawled up the back of my neck, settling deeply into my spine. My son had called me in the middle of the night, just hours before his death, and I had slept right through the ringing. The guilt was a sharp, sudden blade in my chest, a heavy weight of regret for not being awake when he needed me most. But I pushed it down, burying it under a wall of cold, analytical focus. I extended my index finger and pressed the large mechanical play button on the machine. The microcassette whirred to life with a loud analog click. The speaker crackled with static, picking up the heavy, distorted sound of background noise. It sounded like a car driving at high speeds on an empty highway, the wind roaring aggressively against a rolled-down window, accompanied by the distinct heavy hum of an engine being pushed to its absolute limit. Then a voice broke through the thick static. It was Colin. But it did not sound like the confident, brilliant chief executive officer who commanded a $50 million tech empire. He sounded entirely broken. His voice was ragged, desperate, and completely breathless. He was gasping for air, speaking in a frantic, terrifyingly rushed whisper, as if he knew he had only seconds left to speak. I stood completely frozen in my kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the wooden desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could hear the sheer panic vibrating in my son's chest. He took a sharp, agonizing breath before forcing the words out. "Dad, Colin's voice crackled through the small plastic speaker, thick with absolute terror. "Dad, the pills," she swapped. "The pills check the lockbox in Concord. They are draining the accounts." The recorded message abruptly cut off. But it did not end with a simple click. It ended with the violent, chaotic sound of glass shattering into 1,000 pieces, followed immediately by a wet, terrifying gasp for air that sounded absolutely inhuman. Then the line went completely dead. The answering machine clicked loudly, rewinding the tape and plunging my kitchen back into total silence. I stood there in the dark, barely breathing, the truth hitting me with the devastating force of a freight train. My son did not die of a natural cause. Monica did not just steal from him. She murdered him. The morning sun pierced through the blinds of my kitchen window, casting long, harsh shadows across the floor. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the entire night sitting in the dark, replaying that terrifying, distorted voicemail over and over, until the sound of my son fighting for his final breaths was permanently burned into my memory. The initial wave of paralyzing shock had entirely dissolved, leaving behind a cold, mechanical determination. Monica and Trent believed they had scrubbed the digital footprint of their massive financial crime. They thought wiping the private server would erase the undeniable proof of their embezzlement fraud and ultimately murder. But they had forgotten that physical servers are managed by human beings, and my son was a meticulous man who never trusted a single system without a hard physical backup. I needed to get inside his corporate office before Monica completely sterilized the workspace. I put on a pair of comfortable, slightly worn khaki trousers and a faded beige cardigan, deliberately choosing clothes that made me look fragile, harmless, and completely out of touch with the modern world. I drove to the gleaming glass and steel headquarters of Colin logistics firm in downtown Charlotte. The building was a monument to his genius rising proudly against the skyline. I parked my car and walked slowly toward the towering glass entrance, allowing my shoulders to slump. I let my hands develop a slight, noticeable tremor. I was about to give the performance of my life. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up from her glowing monitor when I approached. I asked for Monica, letting my voice waver with an exaggerated vulnerability. 10 minutes later, my daughter-in-law emerged from a set of frosted glass double doors. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray designer suit, looking every bit the newly crowned chief executive officer. When she saw me standing there looking small and lost, a flash of pure irritation crossed her face, quickly replaced by a painfully artificial smile. "Richard," she said, her tone dripping with loud theatrical sympathy meant for the surrounding employees to hear. "What are you doing here? You should be at home resting." I blinked rapidly, looking around the expansive modern lobby, as if the bright lights were severely confusing me. "I just wanted a few pictures," I stammered, making sure my voice sounded suitably pathetic. I was sitting at home, Monica, and I realized I do not have that framed photograph of Colin and me from his college graduation, the one he kept on his desk. I just wanted to hold it. "Please, I will not take more than a few minutes of your time." Monica sighed, glancing quickly at her expensive gold watch. The subtle annoyance in her eyes confirmed everything I needed to know. She viewed me as an absolute nuisance, a lingering ghost that refused to fade away. But denying a grieving father a simple photograph in front of her entire administrative staff would severely damage the saintly widow narrative she was meticulously building. "Of course, Richard," she said smoothly, placing a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "You can go into his office. But please be quick. Trent and I have a very important board meeting to prepare for this afternoon. We are doing everything we can to keep Colin's incredible vision alive." She led me through the maze of sleek cubicles and open-concept workspaces, proudly displaying her complete authority. When we reached Colin's massive corner office, she unlocked the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The space was immaculate, smelling faintly of citrus cleaning products. They had already started boxing up his personal belongings. "I will leave you to your memories, Richard," she murmured softly, though her eyes scanned the room like a hawk. "Just pull the door shut when you are finished." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The second the heavy door clicked shut, my entire posture changed. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. My slumped shoulders straightened. I was no longer a confused, grieving old man. I was a chief engineer standing inside a hostile structure, searching for the critical weak point. I moved quickly and silently across the thick carpet. I went straight to Colin's massive custom-built mahogany desk. The surface was entirely clear, stripped of any useful paperwork or digital tablets. I dropped to one knee and examined the primary drawers. The top three glided open easily, completely empty save for a few stray paper clips and pens. But the bottom drawer, the deep filing cabinet, was firmly locked. I ran my fingers along the edge of the metal locking mechanism. It was a standard commercial-grade cylinder lock. Monica had likely assumed this drawer contained nothing but old tax records or meaningless corporate contracts, saving it for the shredder later. But I knew my son. He always secured his most vital information at the very bottom. I reached into the pocket of my faded cardigan and pulled out a small, heavy-duty steel tension wrench and a standard diamond pick. I had carried them on my keychain for decades, a habit from my years inspecting padlocked construction sites. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying a very light, steady pressure with my left thumb. With my right hand, I slid the diamond pick inside, feeling for the tiny brass pins. 1, 2, 3. I applied a microscopic upward force, listening closely to the faint metallic clicks. My engineering background made this incredibly simple. A lock is just a mechanical puzzle relying on aligned friction. 4, 5. With a final satisfying snap, the cylinder rotated cleanly. I pulled the heavy drawer open. My heart sank. The drawer was completely empty. There were no hidden ledgers, no encrypted hard drives, no files detailing offshore accounts. Monica and Trent had clearly been thorough when they sterilized the office. They had already removed whatever physical documents Colin had kept locked away. I crouched there, staring into the dark, empty void of the drawer, calculating my next move. The private server was wiped. The desk was empty. But then a distinct memory flashed through my mind. When Colin was a teenager, he built his own computer from scrap parts in our garage. He was fiercely protective of his work. Whenever he coded something incredibly important, he never left the backup disk inside the machine. He used to tape his flash drives directly underneath the bottom panel of his desk drawers, knowing no one would ever think to lie on their back and reach up into the tiny dusty gap between the floor and the cabinet. It was a paranoid, brilliant habit he had kept through college. I pressed the side of my face against the carpet and reached my arm deep into the narrow, dark cavity beneath the bottom drawer housing. I stretched my fingers as far as they could possibly go, feeling the rough, unfinished wood of the desk's underside. My fingertips brushed against something small, smooth, and wrapped in heavy electrical tape. A sharp surge of adrenaline flooded my veins. I dug my fingernails into the thick tape and pulled hard. It tore away with a muffled ripping sound. I pulled my hand back into the light. Resting in my palm was a sleek, black, military-grade encrypted flash drive. Colin had backed up the wiped server. He had left the digital map right here, perfectly hidden in plain sight. I quickly shoved the small drive deep into my pocket and pushed the bottom drawer closed, ensuring the cylinder lock clicked back into its secure position. Just as I stood up and brushed the lint from my knees, the heavy wooden office door swung open without a single warning knock. Trent Harrison stood in the doorway. He was wearing an expensive, tailored navy suit, holding a sleek digital tablet. His dark eyes instantly locked onto me, narrowing with intense, calculated suspicion. He scanned the room, looking for any sign of disturbance, checking the alignment of the desk and the positioning of the chairs. "What are you doing in here on the floor?" Richard Trent asked, his voice low and tight with barely contained hostility. I seamlessly dropped back into my performance. I let my shoulders slump heavily forward. I widened my eyes, forcing my hands to resume their fragile, pathetic tremor. I looked at him with an expression of complete, helpless confusion. "Oh, hello there," I stammered, my voice cracking perfectly. I dropped my reading glasses. I was just crawling around trying to find them. Monica said I could look for a picture of my boy. Have you seen a picture? The one from his graduation. I cannot seem to remember where he kept it. Trent stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He was a ruthless corporate shark, but he did not possess a structural engineer's eye for deception. He looked at my faded cardigan, my trembling hands, and my completely lost expression. Slowly, the hard suspicion in his eyes melted into absolute arrogant contempt. He truly believed he was looking at a broken, senile old man who posed absolutely no threat to his massive criminal enterprise. "There are no pictures left in here," Richard Trent said coldly, stepping aside and gesturing toward the open hallway. "The administrative staff packed them all away yesterday. You need to leave now. We have an executive company to run, and this is a restricted corporate floor." I nodded slowly, letting a single pathetic tear gather in the corner of my eye. "I apologize," I whispered, shuffling my feet awkwardly as I walked past him. "I just miss him so much. I will get out of your way now. Thank you for your time." I walked slowly down the long corporate corridor, playing the role of the defeated father, until I finally stepped into the elevator and the stainless steel doors closed completely. The moment I was alone, my trembling stopped. I reached into my pocket and gripped the cold, hard plastic of the encrypted flash drive. Monica and Trent thought they had buried all the evidence. They thought they had successfully erased my son. But they had just handed me the very weapon I was going to use to burn their entire stolen empire to the ground. I stepped out of the gleaming corporate headquarters and into the blinding midday sun of downtown Charlotte. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, sealing Trent Harrison and his towering monument of deceit inside. I kept my head bowed, maintaining the pathetic shuffle of a broken man until I reached my sedan. Once inside, I locked the doors and finally allowed myself to breathe. My fingers traced the rigid rectangular outline of the flash drive deep within my pocket. It felt like a live grenade. Colin had known his time was running out, and he had left me the map to their destruction. I merged into the heavy afternoon traffic, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. After what I had overheard in the cathedral and witnessed in that office, I had to assume they were monitoring me. Trent was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. A man embezzling millions would naturally keep a close watch on the victim's grieving father, ensuring he remained docile and ignorant. I took a winding route back to my neighborhood to confirm no vehicles were tailing me. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had formulated my crucial move. I could not investigate this financial crime while Monica perceived me as an active threat. I needed them to pop the champagne and celebrate their ultimate victory. A predator is most vulnerable the moment it believes the hunt is entirely over. I walked inside my quiet, empty house and locked the deadbolt. I went straight to my kitchen desk, pulling the encrypted flash drive from my pocket and setting it next to the brass safe deposit key. They sat there on the polished wood, two testaments to my son's desperate final days. I needed professional help to decrypt the drive and access the vault in Concord, but making a call from my landline or personal cell phone was far too risky. Trent ran a massive technology firm. It would be simple for his security team to pull my digital records. Before I could summon my allies, I had to completely disarm my enemies. I needed to feed Monica a plausible lie that fit the narrative she had constructed for me. She wanted me weak. She wanted me to surrender. I decided to give her exactly what she desired. I reached for my cell phone, took a slow breath, and pulled the weight of my grief back to the surface, letting it crack my composure. I made my breathing shallow and erratic. When I dialed Monica's number, I was no longer the sharp structural engineer. I was just a tired, lonely widower who had absolutely nothing left to fight for. The phone rang 3 times before she finally answered. "Richard," Monica said. Her tone was sharp, brisk, and dripping with thinly veiled annoyance. She was sitting in a busy office. "I am very busy right now. Did you find your picture and leave the building like Trent asked?" "Monica," I said, letting my voice crack pitifully. I forced a wet, heavy sob into the receiver. "Monica, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything." The line went entirely silent for a moment. The sudden display of absolute emotional collapse had clearly caught her off guard. "Richard, what are you talking about? Are you crying?" "I cannot do this anymore," I whispered, holding the phone away from my mouth to make my breathing sound pathetic. I came back to my empty house and the silence is just too much. Everywhere I look, I see Colin. "You were absolutely right at the lawyer's office." "Right about what?" she asked. The harsh annoyance in her voice shifted into a cautious, eager curiosity. "About the stress," I lied, letting a tear slip down my cheek to fuel the performance. "I am losing my mind with grief. I do not want to fight over companies or board seats or money. None of it will bring my boy back. I cannot stay in this city another day." I heard a faint, distinct shuffling of papers on her end, followed by the soft click of a door closing. She had stepped into a private room. "What are you saying, Richard?" "I am packing my things," I said, my voice trembling violently. "I called an old friend in a retirement community down in Florida. He has a quiet unit available immediately. I will sign the deed over to a real estate agent tomorrow and drive south. I just want to live out my final years in peace. You and Trent can have the company. You can have the estate." There was a long, telling pause. She was digesting the ultimate victory. I could vividly picture the triumphant smirk spreading across her face. The annoying old man was voluntarily banishing himself to a retirement home 1,000 miles away. "Oh, Richard," Monica cooed. Her voice was suddenly drenched in sickening sweetness. "I think that is a wonderfully healthy decision. A fresh start in the Florida sunshine is exactly what you need to heal. Do not worry about a thing here in Charlotte. Trent and I will manage Colin's legacy perfectly. You just focus on packing." "Thank you," I whimpered. "Thank you for understanding. I will not bother you again." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. My trembling stopped completely. The manufactured tears dried on my face, leaving behind a cold, terrifying resolve. My face turned to absolute stone. Monica was popping champagne right now, convinced she had won the war. She would lower her legal defenses, stop monitoring my movements, and drain my son's company without a single care. She had given me the greatest advantage a man seeking vengeance could ask for: total invisibility. I did not walk to my bedroom to pack for Florida. I did not pull out suitcases or call a real estate agent. Instead, I walked to the hallway closet, reached up to the very top shelf, and retrieved a small, dusty cardboard box. Inside the box was a cheap burner phone I purchased years ago for emergencies. I turned it on, watching the digital screen flare to life. I did not need to search for the phone numbers. I had memorized them decades ago. I dialed the first number. It belonged to Thomas Mitchell, a loyal corporate attorney who represented my engineering firm for 30 years. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who despised corporate thieves. He answered on the second ring. "Mitchell." "Thomas," I said. "I need your help. My son did not die of a heart attack, and his wife is attempting a hostile takeover of a $50 million estate." "I am listening, Richard," Thomas replied, his tone instantly shifting into battle mode. "Where do we meet?" "Give me 1 hour," I said. I immediately dialed the second number. This one belonged to Dexter Cole, a retired federal investigator who owed me a massive favor. "Dexter," I said, when the gruff voice answered, "I have an encrypted military flash drive, an unmarked brass key, and a location in Concord. I need you to bring your tools." "Consider it done, old friend," Dexter replied. I hung up the burner phone and looked at the brass key on my kitchen desk. Monica thought she was dealing with a broken old man looking for a quiet retirement. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. The wolf was going on the hunt. Dexter Cole arrived at my house exactly 40 minutes after I made the call. He pulled his dark sedan into my driveway with the quiet efficiency of a man who spent his entire career operating in the shadows. Dexter was a retired federal investigator, a man I had helped out of a severe structural contracting issue over a decade ago. He was built like a heavyweight boxer, with closely cropped gray hair, sharp eyes, and a demeanor that commanded respect. I grabbed the encrypted flash drive, the crumpled toll receipt, and the unmarked brass key. When I slid into his passenger seat, Dexter did not offer me any empty, useless condolences. He simply saw the hardened resolve set in my jaw and put the car in gear. We merged onto the interstate, heading north toward Concord, leaving Charlotte behind us. The drive took over 40 minutes, and the silence was incredibly comfortable. I explained everything I had discovered over the past 3 days. I told him about the forged signature, the whispered conversation I had overheard at the cathedral, and the terrifying, breathless voicemail Colin had left on my answering machine. Dexter listened intently, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He did not interrupt. When I finished detailing the depth of their betrayal, he let out a low, rough breath. He told me that in 30 years of investigating corporate fraud, he had seen money twist people into monsters. However, a wife orchestrating a massive cover-up while her husband was actively dying was a new level of cold-blooded depravity. He promised me that we would tear their entire operation apart, brick by heavy brick. His absolute certainty gave me a renewed sense of strength. I was a man actively dismantling a lethal conspiracy. The town of Concord was exceptionally quiet, providing a stark contrast to the bustling corporate center of downtown Charlotte. Dexter expertly navigated the local streets until we arrived at an inconspicuous single-story brick building located deep within a sterile industrial park. There were no flashy corporate logos and absolutely no indication of the vast wealth stored inside. The brass plaque, mounted beside the reinforced glass door, simply read, "Concord Secure Storage." It was the exact kind of completely secure, off-the-grid facility a man would use if he urgently needed to hide something highly sensitive. We stepped out of this car, the warm evening air immediately wrapping around us. I felt the heavy, cold weight of the brass key burning a hole deep in my trouser pocket. Dexter walked closely beside me, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the empty parking lot. He was naturally falling back into his highly trained federal investigator instincts, ensuring we were not being followed. We walked through the heavy front doors and stepped into a remarkably quiet, empty lobby. The walls were lined with polished steel panels, and a thick pane of bulletproof glass separated the waiting area from the main security desk. An older man in a crisp blue security uniform looked up from his computer monitor as we approached the counter. I stepped forward, pulling the crumpled toll receipt and the heavy brass key from my pocket. I placed the brass key completely flat on the cold metal counter, making a sharp, deliberate sound. I told the guard that I needed to urgently access a private lockbox. He looked at the antique key, then up at my face with a blank, professional expression. He politely asked for the specific name officially registered on the highly secure account. My mind instantly raced back to the long, bright, sunny afternoons Colin and I used to spend fishing at a remote lake near the state border. He was just a young boy back then, and we frequently used to pretend we were famous explorers hiding our vast treasures. I looked the guard directly in the eyes, my voice unwavering, and gave him the specific name my son and I had used as our secret code. I told him the account was under the name Arthur Pendleton. It was an incredibly obscure personal reference. It was something Monica would never in a million years know, care about, or even begin to understand. The guard slowly typed the alias into his computer terminal. The agonizing silence in the lobby stretched out for what felt like an absolute eternity. I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of a wall clock echoing loudly in the quiet room. If Colin had used a different alias out of pure panic, or if Monica already found this place, the investigation would crash. Finally, the guard gave a short, affirmative nod. He pulled a heavy leather binder from beneath the security desk and politely asked for my identification. I handed him my valid state driver license. He examined it closely, meticulously, comparing my aging face to the digital file on his computer screen. Then he slid a paper sign and sheet through the narrow slot in the bulletproof glass. He told me that Arthur Pendleton had specifically listed Richard Caldwell as the only authorized secondary access contact on the account. My brilliant son had perfectly planned for this exact moment. He knew I would eventually figure out the clues. Dexter and I followed the guard through a heavy steel door that required a complex biometric retinal scan. We walked down a brightly lit corridor lined with thousands of identical brushed steel safety deposit boxes. The air was freezing cold and smelled faintly of metallic polish. The guard stopped near the very back of the massive room, motioning toward a small rectangular box. He inserted his master key into the left side of the complex lock mechanism and stepped back. I stepped forward, my hand trembling slightly as I inserted Colin's brass key into the right side. I turned it slowly, feeling the internal tumblers clicking into place. I pulled the drawer out and carried it into a private viewing room just off the corridor. Dexter closed the heavy door, ensuring we were completely isolated. I placed the metal box on the wooden table and took a deep, steadying breath. I forcefully pushed my grief aside and lifted the metal lid. Inside were three incredibly important items. The first item was a thick, black leather-bound ledger. It was completely filled with rows of meticulous handwritten numbers, complex offshore routing codes, and dates stretching back over 2 full years. Colin had been manually tracking every single fraudulent transfer Monica and Trent had pushed through his company. The second item was another physical military-grade encrypted hard drive, undoubtedly the master backup of their massive criminal enterprise. But it was the third item that made my blood run completely cold. It was a small, sealed prescription bottle, clearly labeled with my son's name displaying his specific heart medication dosage. I knew his daily blood pressure pills were very small and chalky white. The pills loudly rattling inside this sealed bottle were definitely not white. They were brightly colored, distinctly oblong, and heavily coated. The lockbox did not just hold the financial proof of their massive corporate theft. It held the very weapon they used to brutally end his young life. I carefully picked up the small plastic bottle from the metal box, feeling the horrifying weight of its implications pressing down on my chest. Dexter leaned over my shoulder, his sharp eyes narrowing, as he registered the bright colors of the capsules inside. We did not need a medical degree to understand what we were looking at right now. Monica had systematically replaced his own vital blood pressure medication with something entirely different, something designed to trigger a catastrophic cardiac event while masking itself as a natural tragedy. I placed the bottle ledger and hard drive into my canvas satchel. We exited the sterile vault in complete silence, walking back through the freezing corridor and past the heavily armed security desk without looking back. The warm night air of Concord hit my face as we returned to the completely unmarked sedan, but I only felt a deep freezing cold settling into my bones. We drove straight back to Charlotte, bypassing my house, and that entire corporate territory completely. We headed directly to a secluded high-end hotel on the southern edge of the sprawling city. Thomas Mitchell had deliberately booked a corner suite under a corporate alias, ensuring absolute privacy. When Dexter knocked twice on the heavy hotel door, Thomas opened it instantly. My old lawyer had stripped off his usual tailored suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, his face set in a grim, combative scowl. He did not waste time with meaningless pleasantries. He ushered us inside and immediately locked the deadbolt. Sitting at the large mahogany dining table in the center of the suite was a young man surrounded by an impressive array of high-powered laptops, tangled cables, and heavily modified server equipment. Thomas introduced him simply as a white-hat hacker genius tonight. This young digital forensic expert was retained exclusively for catastrophic corporate espionage cases. He looked entirely unassuming, dressed in a faded hooded sweatshirt, but his eyes were bright with analytical intelligence. I walked over to the table and unloaded my canvas satchel. I placed the small black flash drive I had retrieved from beneath that desk right next to the heavy military-grade hard drive from the Concord vault. I told the young expert that these drives contained the blueprints of a $50 million theft and the terrifying absolute motive for my only child being meticulously murdered by them. The young man did not ask a single question. He simply nodded, plugged the devices into a complex routing hub, and began typing at a furious, blinding speed. What followed was a grueling, agonizing 12-hour marathon. The hotel suite became a claustrophobic bunker of silence broken only by the rapid clattering of keyboard keys and the low mechanical hum of cooling fans pushing hot air out of the overworked processors. Dexter stood by the window, occasionally parting the thick blackout curtains to monitor the empty parking lot below. Thomas paced the length of the room with focused, endless energy. My loyal attorney was fueled by multiple cups of bitter black coffee, muttering complex legal statutes under his breath as he meticulously prepared the structural framework for a massive federal lawsuit. I sat perfectly still in an armchair in the corner, staring at the small plastic pill bottle resting on the table. My mind was trapped in a dark, terrifying loop. I pictured Colin sitting alone in his office, his chest tightening, his healthy heart reaching desperately for a phone to call me, while the unknown poison his wife had given him systematically destroyed his body from the inside. I channeled that immense, crushing pain into pure, unadulterated focus. I would not allow exhaustion to take hold of me tonight. I would stay awake to see the face of the monster who killed my boy reflected in the cold data. As the deep black of the night slowly gave way to the pale gray light of early morning, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The encryption on the military drive was incredibly sophisticated, deliberately designed to permanently self-destruct if the wrong algorithmic key was applied too many times by an unauthorized outside invasive digital software program. The young expert was sweating heavily, his fingers flying across multiple glowing screens, running localized brute force attacks and complex digital decryption protocols. At exactly 7 in the morning, a loud, sharp digital chime echoed through the quiet hotel suite. The hacker sat back in his chair, exhaling a long, heavy breath, and wiped the accumulated sweat from his forehead. He turned the primary monitor toward the center of the room. The complex encryption had finally been shattered completely. The digital vault was wide open. Thomas, Dexter, and I instantly crowded around the glowing screen to see the stolen truth. Our eyes scanned the endless rows of meticulous digital records Colin had compiled before his sudden death. The files opened one by one, revealing a horrifyingly clear picture of absolute corporate betrayal. It was a massive, carefully concealed trail of offshore wire transfers. Monica and Trent Harrison had not just stolen a little money. They had been executing a brilliant, systematic bleed of the vital liquid assets. The detailed spreadsheets displayed dozens of dummy accounts, routing numbers, and highly secured banking protocols designed to bypass standard corporate oversight and intentionally deceive the internal auditing board during the crucial fiscal reviews. The data showed that they had deliberately set up a network of untraceable shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. They used fabricated vendor invoices, grossly inflated logistics, consulting fees, and completely fictitious software licensing agreements to funnel massive amounts of capital out of Charlotte. I watched the specific numbers scroll across the glowing monitor, tracing the dates of the illegal transfers back over 2 full years. Every single month, like clockwork, another massive chunk of capital vanished from the primary corporate ledger, routed through 3 different international banks, before finally resting in their secret, secure, offshore holding banking accounts. They had been slowly, methodically bleeding his logistics firm dry while smiling to his face. The total amount of stolen funds was staggering. The hacker pulled up the final aggregated spreadsheet, highlighting the total sum in bright red text. $15 million. They had stolen $15 million over 24 months, crippling the operational expansion of the company and forcing Colin to work impossible hours to save the business he loved. The intense pressure Colin had been under, the stress Monica had so convincingly blamed for his supposed mental decline, was entirely manufactured by her insatiable, personal, absolute greed. My son was not losing his mind. He was desperately trying to stop a catastrophic financial hemorrhage orchestrated by the woman he married. And when he finally discovered the truth, when he gathered the hard evidence and secured it in the conquered vault, they knew they were completely out of time. They knew Colin would go straight to the federal authorities and send them both to prison for decades. They had to act quickly, ruthlessly, and without mercy. The poisoned pills were not an accident. They were a necessary, calculated execution to permanently silence the only man who could talk. Thomas Mitchell leaned over the table, his eyes tracing the offshore routing numbers. He let out a low, dangerous growl. He pointed to the specific dates of the final massive wire transfers. They stopped abruptly, exactly 3 weeks ago. That was the exact same time Monica claimed Colin had spontaneously decided to revise his final will and testament, removing my name and leaving her with absolute control. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with devastating, undeniable clarity. The fake forged will was not just a greedy afterthought. It was the crucial, terrifying centerpiece of their entire master plan. They realized that stealing $15 million was highly dangerous, leaving a trail that could eventually be uncovered by aggressive corporate auditors. But if Colin suddenly died, and Monica inherited the entire $50 million company as the sole uncontested beneficiary, the theft would no longer matter. As the new chief executive officer, she could simply absorb the missing $15 million as a standard operational loss, burying the fraud forever. The fake will was their final step to steal the remaining $50 million without any interference from a grieving father. They wanted the entire empire completely for themselves. I stood there in the brightly lit hotel room, staring at the hard digital evidence of his brutal murder. Monica and Trent had planned the perfect crime banking entirely on my silent surrender. They thought I would take their insulting $10,000 settlement move quietly to Florida and let them enjoy the massive fortune they had stolen over the rigid body of my son. They were completely wrong about me. I reached down and picked up the bottle of poisoned pills. I looked at Dexter and Thomas, feeling cold, mechanical rage locking into solid place. We prepare for war. I would stay awake to see the face of the monsters who destroyed my family reflected in the cold, hard data. As the deep black of the night slowly gave way to the pale gray light of early morning, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The encryption on the military drive was incredibly sophisticated, deliberately designed to permanently self-destruct if the wrong algorithmic key was applied too many times by an unauthorized outside invasive digital software program. The young expert was sweating heavily, his fingers flying across multiple glowing screens, running localized brute force attacks and complex digital decryption protocols. Every passing hour felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I thought about Monica sleeping soundly in her expensive bed, entirely convinced she had won the war. I thought about Trent walking into his corporate office, arrogantly assuming his criminal empire was completely secure. They had no idea that 3 men in a dark hotel room were systematically dismantling the digital fortress they had built around their lives. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet, gently touching the edge of Colin's graduation photograph. I remembered his relentless drive, his brilliant mind, and the absolute trust he had placed in the people closest to him. He had built a logistics empire from the ground up, only to be surrounded by predators who smiled to his face while plunging a knife into his back. But Colin was my son, and he possessed an engineer's meticulous foresight. He knew the structural integrity of his company was failing, and he had left the necessary tools for me to find. The silence in the hotel room was deafening, the tension wrapping around us like a tightly coiled wire waiting to violently snap. At exactly 7 in the morning, a loud, sharp digital chime echoed through the quiet hotel suite. The young hacker sat back in his chair, exhaling a long, heavy breath, and wiped the accumulated sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He turned the primary monitor toward the center of the room. The complex encryption had finally been shattered completely. The digital vault was wide open. Thomas, Dexter, and I instantly crowded around the glowing screen, our eyes scanning the endless rows of meticulous digital records Colin had compiled before his sudden death. The files opened one by one, revealing a horrifyingly clear picture of absolute corporate betrayal. It was a massive, carefully concealed trail of offshore wire transfers. Monica and Trent Harrison had not just stolen a little money to fund a lavish lifestyle. They had been executing a brilliant systematic bleed of the vital liquid assets. The detailed spreadsheets displayed dozens of dummy accounts, complex routing numbers and highly secured banking protocols designed to bypass standard corporate oversight. They had intentionally deceived the internal auditing board during the crucial fiscal reviews, hiding their tracks with masterful precision. The data showed that they had deliberately set up a network of untraceable shell companies located deep in the Cayman Islands. They used fabricated vendor invoices, grossly inflated logistics consulting fees, and completely fictitious software licensing agreements to funnel massive amounts of capital straight out of Charlotte. I watched the specific numbers scroll across the glowing monitor, tracing the dates of the illegal transfers back over 2 full years. Every single month, like clockwork, another massive chunk of capital vanished from the primary corporate ledger, routed through 3 different international banks, before finally resting in their accounts. They had been slowly, methodically bleeding his logistics firm dry while smiling to his face. The total amount of stolen funds was staggering. The hacker pulled up the final aggregated spreadsheet, highlighting the total sum in bright red text. $15 million. They had stolen $15 million over 2 years, crippling the operational expansion of the company and forcing Colin to work impossible hours to save the business he loved. The intense pressure Colin had been under, the stress Monica had so convincingly blamed for his supposed mental decline, was entirely manufactured by her insatiable personal greed. My son was not losing his mind. He was desperately trying to stop a catastrophic financial hemorrhage orchestrated by the woman he married. And when he finally discovered the truth, when he gathered the hard evidence and secured it in the conquered vault, they knew they were completely out of time. They knew Colin would go straight to the federal authorities and send them both to prison for decades. They had to act quickly, ruthlessly, and without any mercy. Thomas Mitchell leaned over the table, his eyes tracing the offshore routing numbers. He let out a low, dangerous growl. He pointed to the specific dates of the final massive wire transfers. They stopped abruptly, exactly 3 weeks ago. That was the exact same time Monica claimed Colin had spontaneously decided to revise his final will and testament, removing my name and leaving her with absolute control. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with devastating, undeniable clarity. Stealing $15 million was incredibly dangerous, leaving a massive digital footprint that could eventually be uncovered by auditors. But if Colin suddenly died, and Monica inherited the entire company as the sole uncontested beneficiary, the theft would no longer matter. She could easily absorb the missing funds, completely burying the fraud forever. The fake will was their final step to steal the remaining $50 million without interference. The words hung in the heavy air of the hotel suite, a solemn vow forged in the undeniable proof of my son's murder. Thomas gave a sharp, definitive nod, his legal mind already constructing the precise sequence of injunctions and federal subpoenas required to freeze Monica out of the corporate accounts. Dexter simply crossed his massive arms over his chest, his posture radiating the quiet, dangerous stillness of a veteran hunter who has just locked onto his prey. I stood at the mahogany table holding the lethal prescription bottle, feeling the horrifying reality sinking deeply in. But before Thomas could outline our immediate tactical strategy, the young digital forensic expert raised his hand. His fingers hovered over his glowing keyboard, his eyes darting frantically across a cascading stream of complex digital code on his secondary monitor. He told us that he had found something else. The massive financial ledger was not the only item hidden within the military-grade hard drive. There was a deeply buried secondary partition cloaked beneath an entirely different algorithmic lock. It was a single massive file intentionally isolated from the offshore wire transfers. The hacker explained that this specific partition was not encrypted with a standard corporate security protocol. It was protected by a unique biometric digital key, a highly personalized code that Colin must have manually programmed himself. The young man typed with blinding speed, running the remaining decrypted data fragments through a rapid sequencing program to isolate the secondary lock. The hotel room fell back into a suffocating, unbearable silence. The low hum of the cooling fans seemed to vibrate directly inside my chest. I stared at the central monitor, my hands gripping the back of a wooden dining chair so tightly my aging joints actually ached terribly now. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then the black screen flickered brightly. A progress bar appeared rapidly, filling from left to right, as the complex software finally shattered the secondary barrier. The digital vault groaned open, revealing a single video file resting alone in the dark directory. The file name was simply my first name, Richard. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a physical blow. Thomas stepped back, giving me a wide berth, intuitively understanding the profound gravity of what we were about to witness. The young hacker slowly clicked the mouse to open the hidden video. The media player launched, filling the large monitor with a harsh, grainy light. And then my son was suddenly there. Seeing Colin alive on that screen, breathing and moving, felt like a jagged knife twisting violently in my stomach. The video had clearly been recorded inside his private corporate office late at night, illuminated only by the stark, pale glow of his desk lamp. The digital timestamp glowing in the bottom corner indicated it was recorded exactly 48 hours before his heart finally stopped beating. But the man looking into the camera lens was not the vibrant corporate executive. Colin looked absolutely terrifying. He was drenched in a thick, unnatural sweat, his skin a pallid, sickly shade of gray. Deep, bruised shadows carved hollows under his desperate eyes. His breathing was visibly shallow and ragged, his chest rising and falling in chaotic, erratic jerks. He looked like a man standing on the very edge of an abyss, fighting a losing battle against his own failing body. He leaned close to the camera, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the edge of his mahogany desk to steady his collapsing physical frame. "Dad," Colin whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse, cracking, with a mixture of profound exhaustion and absolute terror. "I hope you never actually have to watch this. I hope I can bring this drive to the federal authorities tomorrow morning. But my heart is racing, Dad. It has been pounding against my ribs for 3 days straight, and I cannot make it slow down. I cannot sleep. I cannot catch my breath. I am shaking constantly. I thought it was just the stress of the logistics firm. I thought the pressure of the expansion was finally breaking me. But Monica has been watching me so closely since last week. She hovers over me every time I take my blood pressure medication. She insists on bringing me my water. She insists on handing me the pills. I did not want to believe it. I did not want to believe that my own wife would do something so incredibly evil. But I finally looked inside the bottle today. The capsules are wrong, Dad. They are slightly different. I think she is giving me heavy amphetamines. I think she is intentionally trying to trigger a massive cardiac arrest to cover up what she has done." Colin paused, closing his tired eyes tightly. A sudden, sharp spasm of pain visibly rippled across his chest. He took a long, trembling breath, forcing his eyes open, forcing himself to push through the agony, to document the truth. "I found the offshore accounts, Dad," he continued, his voice dropping into a hard, venomous register. "Monica and Trent Harrison. They have been bleeding the corporate accounts dry for 2 years. They set up fake vendors in the Cayman Islands. They stole $15 million right out from under me. Trent manipulated the internal audits, and Monica handled the executive authorizations. I was completely blind to it all. I trusted them with my entire life, and they used my signature to mask their massive theft. I spent the last 3 weeks quietly compiling every single fraudulent transaction, every forged invoice, every illegal wire transfer. It is all on this drive. The whole undeniable proof. But they know I am closing in. Trent locked me out of the primary server this afternoon. Monica is watching my every single move. They know I have the ledger. They know they are going to prison. And they know my specific heart condition makes me incredibly vulnerable." My son looked directly at me. The sheer naked fear in his eyes shattered my soul. He knew he was dying. He knew the lethal cocktail of synthesized drugs coursing through his veins was already doing irreparable damage to his fragile heart. I can feel my dying pulse fluttering, Dad, Colin whispered, lifting a trembling hand to press against his chest. I am so dizzy. I tried to leave the building, but Trent has the security team monitoring the private elevators. I am trapped on the executive floor. I am going to wait until they leave for the night, and then I will secure the drive. I am going to hide this drive under my desk and put the physical ledger in the Concord vault. I have to secure the evidence before my heart gives out. I know Monica will try to take the company. I know she will manufacture some terrible lie about my mental state. She has been planting the seeds for months, telling the board of directors that I am paranoid and delusional. She is setting the stage to steal all the remaining $50 million the moment I am gone. She thinks she has accounted for every single variable to win completely. But she underestimated me, Dad, Colin said, a sudden fierce spark of our shared engineering defiance lighting up his dying eyes. She thinks I am just a completely trusting fool. But I saw her going through my personal files yesterday. I knew she would try to forge a revised will to cut you out and take absolute control of the estate. I could not let her win. I could not let her take the empire we built. Colin reached below the frame of the camera. When his hand reappeared, he was holding a thick, pristine stack of legal documents securely, bound tightly in a blue folder. He held the pages up to the bright light of his desk lamp. The camera clearly captured a highly distinct, intricate holographic seal stamped directly across the front page. It was a federal digital watermark, an absolute unforgeable guarantee of legal authenticity. I had my private attorneys draft this document yesterday morning. Colin explained, his breathing growing even more labored and desperate. It is registered directly with the state probate court and digitally locked into the federal registry. It completely supersedes any fraudulent garbage Monica might try to present after I am gone forever. Dad, if you're watching this, I did not make it to the FBI in time. This is my true legally binding will. I leave everything to you, the logistics firm, the liquid assets, the offshore properties, everything. Do not let her win. Do not let them take my remaining life and steal my legacy. A tear finally slipped down my son's pale cheek, a tragic mixture of fear and profound love. Crush them, Dad. Take everything. The video abruptly faded into total darkness. My eyes were entirely dry, filled with a terrifying, absolute, and utterly unbreakable cold steel resolve. The silence in the hotel suite stretched into a heavy, suffocating eternity, as the black screen reflected my rigid posture. Thomas closed his laptop with a sharp snap, breaking the spell that held us captive. Dexter stepped away from the window, his large hands resting on his hips, as he looked at me with profound respect. There was no need for words. The objective was no longer a simple matter of corporate fraud. It was a matter of total retribution. We gathered the physical evidence, placing the thick leather ledger, the decrypted military hard drive, and the private toxicology report into my canvas satchel. We left the hotel room before morning traffic had begun to build, moving with the urgent precision of soldiers heading to the front lines. Thomas had already made the necessary calls. We were not going to a local police precinct. We were heading to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We drove into the secure underground parking facility of the federal building just as the city of Charlotte was waking up. Thomas bypassed the standard visitor checkpoints, flashing his high-level credentials and leading us straight into a windowless, soundproof conference room. Waiting for us at the long metal table were 4 individuals. 2 were seasoned federal agents in crisp, dark suits, their expressions carefully neutral. Beside them sat the regional district attorney, a sharp, formidable woman named Sarah Jenkins, known for her aggressive prosecution of corporate crimes. Dexter greeted one of the agents with a firm, familiar handshake, silently signaling that I was a man to be taken entirely seriously. I took the seat at the head of the cold metal table and placed my canvas satchel right in the center. I began by sliding the thick leather ledger across the polished surface. I spoke with the calm, methodical precision of an engineer outlining a catastrophic structural failure. I explained the offshore wire transfers, the dummy accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the fabricated vendor invoices. I handed them the decrypted hard drive explaining that it contained the complete digital footprint of a $15 million embezzlement scheme orchestrated by Trent Harrison and my daughter-in-law. The agents plugged the drive into their secure terminal, their detachment vanishing as they scrolled through the irrefutable data my son had compiled. The district attorney leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she grasped the sheer magnitude of the corporate theft sitting in front of her. But the financial bleeding was only the foundational layer of their absolute depravity. I reached into the satchel and pulled out the crisp white folder containing the private toxicology report Dexter had secured just hours ago. I slid it across the table toward the district attorney. I watched her open the file, her eyes scanning the complex chemical breakdowns and the terrifying final conclusion. I explained that Monica had systematically replaced my son's vital blood pressure medication with synthesized high-dose amphetamines. She had deliberately engineered a lethal chemical cocktail guaranteed to overwork his fragile heart and trigger a massive, untraceable cardiac arrest. The room went entirely still. The agents stopped looking at the glowing computer screens and turned their attention to me, the gravity of premeditated murder settling heavily over the table. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow. I asked the digital expert to play the hidden video file we had extracted from the secondary encrypted partition. The massive monitor on the far wall flared to life, casting a pale light across the faces of the federal agents. They watched in absolute silence as my son, sweating and dying, looked directly into the camera lens and detailed his own murder. They listened to his ragged breathing as he explained the forged documents, the stolen millions, and the ultimate betrayal. They watched him hold up his true, legally binding final will, carrying the undeniable federal digital watermark. When the video finally faded to black, nobody in the soundproof room moved a single muscle. The emotional impact was heavy, yet I sat there with a face carved from solid granite. The lead federal agent stood up, his jaw tightly clenched. He looked at the district attorney and stated that they had more than enough probable cause to move immediately. He wanted to dispatch tactical teams to Monica's luxury home and Trent Harrison's corporate office right now. He wanted to place them both in federal custody before lunchtime, freezing their assets and shutting down the entire logistics firm to preserve the crime scene. He outlined a rapid, aggressive strike designed to blindside them before they even realized their digital fortress had been completely breached. The district attorney nodded in agreement, reaching for her cell phone to authorize the arrest warrants and begin the massive process of seizing a $50 million corporate empire. I raised my hand, placing it flat against the cold metal table. I told them to stop. The federal agent frowned, clearly confused by my sudden interruption. I looked directly at the district attorney and stated that arresting them in their homes this morning was simply not good enough. If we took them down right now, Trent would immediately deploy his army of expensive corporate lawyers. He would claim complete ignorance of the offshore accounts. Monica would play the grieving widow, insisting she knew nothing about the poisoned pills or the missing millions. They would tie the federal courts up in endless, agonizing litigations for years, blaming my dead son for the financial discrepancies. I refused to let them hide behind a wall of expensive legal obfuscation. I wanted them to publicly hang themselves. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the district attorney. I told her we needed to wait 24 hours. Tomorrow afternoon, Monica and Trent were hosting an emergency board meeting at the headquarters. They summoned all the primary shareholders, executive directors, and major regional investors. Monica was planning to present the forged will and officially crown herself as the new chief executive officer. She planned to liquidate the remaining assets and absorb the missing $15 million under the guise of restructuring. We needed to let her commit the ultimate act of fraud in front of highly credible witnesses. The district attorney lowered her phone, a calculating smile spreading across her face. She understood the brilliance of the delay. By presenting the forged will to the board, Monica would commit massive, irrefutable federal wire fraud, corporate perjury, and grand larceny in broad daylight. We spent the rest of the morning mapping out every second of the emergency meeting. We coordinated the exact timing of the tactical breach, ensuring all exits would be sealed the moment I gave the signal. Monica believed she had orchestrated the perfect corporate takeover. She thought she was untouchable, insulated by her constructed lies and the narrative of a sudden heart attack. She firmly believed the broken old man had fled to Florida, leaving her the queen of a $50 million empire. I am going to let her walk into that boardroom tomorrow. I will let her smile take the podium and climb to the top step of her stolen throne before I kick the ladder completely away. The following afternoon arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that radiated through the towering glass windows of the corporate headquarters. Up on the 50th floor, inside the sleek glass-walled boardroom that overlooked the sprawling Charlotte skyline, a quiet atmosphere of manufactured grief had been perfectly curated. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady note, chilling the large room to a crisp, clinical temperature. Monica stood at the very head of the massive, polished oak table. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored, pitch-black designer suit that projected an image of mourning, yet demanded absolute authority. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her makeup entirely flawless. Beside her stood Trent Harrison, wearing a dark navy blazer, his arms crossed over his chest, sporting a highly confident predatory smirk that he barely bothered to conceal from the gathered executives. Seated around the expansive table in plush, high-backed leather chairs were the primary shareholders, the regional investors, and the senior executive directors of Colin Logistics firm. These were powerful, intelligent men and women, yet they sat in complete, respectful silence, entirely captivated by the saintly widow performance Monica was currently delivering. She held a crisp, white tissue in her left hand, gently dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. Her voice trembled with a meticulously practiced sorrow as she spoke about the sudden tragic loss of her brilliant husband. She spoke about his relentless passion, his sleepless nights, and his beautiful vision for the future of the technology empire he had built from nothing. She painted a vivid, heartbreaking portrait of a man who had simply worked his own heart into a fatal collapse. It was a masterful, sickening display of emotional manipulation. She was utilizing the absolute tragedy of his death, the very death she had meticulously orchestrated with a lethal bottle of amphetamines, as a stepping stone to absolute corporate power. Trent nodded solemnly as she spoke, playing the role of the devoted, loyal corporate confidant who was stepping up to guide the grieving widow through the complicated legal transition of a $50 million estate. "I know Colin would have wanted us to push forward," Monica said, her voice dropping into a brave, hushed whisper that echoed softly across the silent boardroom. He poured his entire soul into this company. He sacrificed everything to see it succeed. And in his final weeks, as the stress began to cloud his brilliant mind, he realized that he needed to protect this legacy at all costs. He wanted to ensure that the vision we built together would never be compromised by outside interference or distracted leadership. Trent stepped forward smoothly, placing a thick, leather-bound portfolio directly onto the center of the polished oak table. He opened the heavy cover, revealing the freshly printed legal documents containing the blatantly forged signature. "That is why we are gathered here today," Trent announced, his voice projecting a smooth, commanding baritone. "To honor the final legally documented wishes of our founder. As you all know, Colin recently revised his last will and testament, appointing his wife as the sole beneficiary and absolute controlling shareholder of this logistics enterprise. Today we must formally ratify the immediate liquidation of certain restricted assets and officially transfer the executive voting rights to Monica. This will permanently stabilize our market position and reassure our clients that the future of this company is entirely secure." The board members nodded in solemn agreement, completely blind to the $15 million deficit expertly hidden within the offshore Cayman accounts. They had no idea that they were actively participating in the final stage of a massive, bloody heist. They were simply eager to move past the tragedy and secure their own financial portfolios without disruption. They reached for their crystal water glasses, ready to rubber stamp the massive transition of power and wealth. Monica reached across the table with graceful, deliberate movements. She picked up a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. She looked down at the final transfer papers, the absolute culmination of 2 years of systematic bleeding and calculated poison. I could easily imagine the triumphant thrill racing through her veins. In just a few seconds, her signature would lock the stolen $50 million safely behind a wall of impenetrable corporate bureaucracy. She would absorb the missing funds, cover her tracks, and walk away as an extraordinarily wealthy, untouchable queen. She lowered the sharp golden nib of the pen toward the thick dotted signature line at the very bottom of the crisp white page. She was hovering just a fraction of an inch above her ultimate victory. That was the exact moment I kicked the ladder completely away. The heavy, solid oak double doors of the glass-walled boardroom did not just open. They swung inward with a sudden violent force that sounded like a physical explosion, slamming hard against the interior walls. The loud, aggressive crash echoed like a gunshot, instantly shattering the quiet, respectful silence of the executive meeting. Every single head around the massive table snapped toward the entrance in absolute collective shock. I walked into the room, my footsteps heavy measured and entirely unyielding against the polished hardwood floor. I was no longer wearing the faded beige cardigan or the soft khaki trousers. I had shed the pathetic, trembling disguise of a broken, senile widower completely. I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit, my shoulders pulled back, my spine perfectly straight, channeling every single ounce of the ruthless, commanding structural engineer who had spent decades dominating corporate boardrooms and tearing down corrupt contractors. My face was carved from cold, solid granite. My eyes locked directly onto Monica, radiating a silent, terrifying promise of absolute destruction. I was not walking alone. Flanking my left side was Thomas Mitchell, my fiercely loyal attorney, clutching a thick, black leather briefcase filled with the decrypted offshore ledgers, the private toxicology report, and the digital video file that would end her life. Flanking my right side and filing quickly into the room behind us were 4 grim-faced federal agents. They were dressed in dark matching suits, their silver badges prominently displayed, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They fanned out with practiced military precision, immediately blocking the main exit and securing the perimeter of the executive meeting space. The fountain pen slipped from Monica's fingers, clattering loudly onto the polished oak table and leaving a dark, jagged ink stain across the forged document. The artificial, sorrowful smile she had been holding for the past 20 minutes completely froze on her flawless face. Her bright eyes widened in sudden, absolute terror as she stared at the federal agents securing the room. She looked at my dark suit, my steady hands, and the cold, unblinking fury in my eyes, finally realizing that the fragile, confused old man she thought she had outsmarted had just orchestrated a massive lethal trap. The vibrant color rapidly drained from her pristine cheeks. Trent Harrison took a sudden, panicked, defensive step backward, his previous arrogance evaporating into thin air as he quickly registered the silver federal badges, blocking his only path of escape. The trapped wolves suddenly realized that they were completely surrounded. For a single agonizing fraction of a second, the sheer magnitude of her impending ruin paralyzed her completely. Then her survival instinct kicked in, manifesting as pure, unfiltered hysteria. Monica slammed her perfectly manicured hands onto the polished oak table, her voice cracking into a high, piercing shriek that echoed violently against the thick glass walls. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest and loudly demanded that the building security immediately throw this senile, delusional old man out of her corporate boardroom. She screamed that I was having a severe mental breakdown, that I was a grieving, pathetic father who had completely lost his grip on reality and was actively trying to ruin her husband's beautiful legacy. Trent Harrison quickly stepped forward, his face flushed with panicked adrenaline, loudly insisting that the federal agents had no legal jurisdiction to interrupt a private executive shareholder meeting. He demanded to see a warrant immediately, his voice dripping with an artificial, desperate authority that convinced absolutely no one in the room. The board members simply stared in stunned, breathless silence, completely paralyzed by the sudden eruption of absolute chaos unfolding right before their very eyes. I completely ignored all of their frantic, pathetic screams. I did not blink, and I absolutely did not break my icy stare. I walked slowly and deliberately to the very center of the massive table, the sharp clicking of my leather shoes cutting through the frantic noise they were making. I stopped directly across from Monica. I reached into my canvas satchel and pulled out the heavy military-grade hard drive. I raised it high above the table, letting the bright overhead lights catch its brushed metal casing before slamming it down onto the polished oak surface with a deafening, heavy thud. The sudden, violent impact made Monica physically jump backward, her breath hitching sharply in her throat. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and told her that this particular drive contained the complete unencrypted offshore financial ledgers. I told her it contained the specific routing numbers, the dummy vendor accounts located in the Cayman Islands, and the undeniable proof of the $15 million she and Trent had systematically stolen from my son over the past 24 entire months. Trent Harrison let out a choked, breathless gasp, his knees visibly buckling as the absolute reality of his dire situation crashed down upon him. He knew the digital forensic trail was impossible to deny. The massive amounts of missing money could be tracked, the international IP addresses could be verified, and the digital signatures would point directly back to his own computer terminal. Monica, however, completely refused to surrender gracefully. She stubbornly clung to her very final, desperate lie. She wildly claimed that Colin had authorized those transfers himself, that he was the one hiding money from the corporate auditors, and that her recently updated document gave her the absolute legal right to manage the financial fallout. That is exactly when Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, his tailored suit jacket pushed back his posture, radiating the lethal confidence of a veteran litigator who was about to deliver a fatal blow to a hostile witness. He placed his heavy black leather briefcase onto the table right next to the hard drive. With smooth, practiced efficiency, Thomas unlatched the brass locks and pulled out a thick, pristine stack of legal documents, securely bound in a bright blue folder. He held the pages up for the entire boardroom to see clearly. The bright overhead lights perfectly illuminated the highly distinct, intricate holographic seal stamped directly across the front page. Thomas announced to the silent, captivated board of directors that what he was holding was the true, legally binding final will and testament of Colin Caldwell. He calmly explained, his voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority, that this specific document carried a permanent federal digital watermark. It was registered directly with the state probate court and digitally locked into the federal registry a mere 48 hours before Colin suffered his fatal cardiac event. Thomas turned his sharp, calculating gaze toward Monica, his voice dropping into a cold, clinical register. He stated that this federal document completely superseded any fraudulent, unverified, and conveniently timed revisions she might attempt to present to this board today. The warm color entirely drained from Monica's pale face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Her perfectly constructed reality was crumbling into dust right in front of her eyes. She reached out her fingers, trembling violently, wanting to snatch the blue folder away, but the looming presence of the federal agents kept her frozen in place. Thomas cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he opened the blue folder to the primary declarative pages. He began to read the document aloud, his voice steady and entirely unforgiving. He read Colin's exact, meticulously drafted words, and the legal jargon was incredibly sharp and devastating. Colin explicitly stated that due to recently discovered and currently under investigation acts of massive financial fraud, severe corporate embezzlement, and profound personal betrayal, he was formally, completely, and permanently disinheriting his wife. Thomas read the specific punishing clauses that revoked all of Monica's executive privileges, nullified her access to any corporate bank accounts, and stripped her of every single marital asset connected to the logistics empire. The wealthy board members exchanged wide-eyed, shocked glances as the full, crushing weight of the accusations settled over the room. They were witnessing the total, public destruction of the reigning chief executive officer before she had even officially taken the throne. The whispered murmurs of the shareholders began to swell a rising tide of realization and absolute condemnation, directed squarely at the trembling woman standing at the very head of the polished oak table. Then Thomas reached the final, most crucial paragraph of the authenticated document. His voice grew significantly louder, ensuring every single person in the massive room heard the absolute finality of Colin's ultimate decision. He read that 100% of the $50 million company, all outstanding liquid assets, all offshore properties, and all executive voting rights were immediately and irrevocably transferred solely to his father, Richard Caldwell. I watched Monica closely as the undeniable words hit her like a series of brutal physical blows. Her mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no sound came out of her throat. Her knees trembled violently beneath her designer skirt, and she slumped heavily into the high-backed leather chair behind her, her manicured hands gripping the wooden armrests in pure, unadulterated shock. She looked around the expansive boardroom, desperately searching for a single friendly face to offer her some meager comfort. She met the eyes of the corporate elite she had tried so desperately to impress and manipulate the wealthy investors she had planned to court with stolen money. She saw their expressions rapidly shifting from mourning to absolute, disgusted horror. They knew exactly what she had done. The four stern federal agents stepped much closer to the table, the soft metallic jingling of heavy steel handcuffs breaking the heavy silence in the room. Monica realized she had just lost everything in front of the corporate elite of Charlotte, forever. For a brief moment, the only sound in the vast boardroom was the ticking of the clock. Then the reality of her destruction broke through Monica's paralyzing shock. She sprang up from the leather chair, her hands gripping the edge of the oak table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice tore through the quiet room, a harsh shriek of absolute denial. She pointed her trembling finger at Thomas Mitchell, screaming that the document he held was a complete forgery. She wildly accused us of fabricating the federal watermark and conspiring to steal her rightful inheritance. She demanded that the board of directors ignore this pathetic old man and his hired actors. She yelled for the security team to throw us out immediately. She turned her pleading eyes toward Trent Harrison, silently begging her partner in crime to step forward and use his corporate authority to validate her frantic lies. She expected him to deploy his usual smooth arrogance, summon the building security, and forcibly remove us from the premises. But Trent did not move to help her. His confident smirk had vanished, replaced by the pale, sweaty sheen of a terrified man who suddenly realized he was standing on the gallows and the trapdoor was about to open beneath his shoes. Trent was not looking at Monica. His terrified eyes were locked onto the canvas satchel resting in the center of the table. He recognized the thick leather ledger sitting there. He clearly saw the military-grade hard drive that he had personally tried to wipe from the company servers just days ago to hide his tracks. But more importantly, he saw the lead federal agent confidently step forward, holding a clear plastic evidence bag up to the bright light. Inside that sealed bag was the small prescription bottle bearing Colin's specific name, resting right next to the federally authenticated toxicology report. Trent was a calculating, cynical corporate predator, and his survival instincts were remarkably sharp under extreme pressure. He instantly processed the overwhelming magnitude of the physical and digital evidence arrayed against them today. He inherently knew the decrypted digital ledgers proved the massive $15 million embezzlement beyond a shadow of a legal doubt. He knew the hidden offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands were completely exposed to federal scrutiny, and looking at the pill bottle, he finally realized that the sudden heart attack they had orchestrated was now officially classified as a premeditated, highly documented murder. The trap had snapped shut entirely, and Trent understood there was absolutely no legal maneuver, no expensive defense attorney, and no corporate loophole that could possibly save his life from spending the rest of his natural days rotting away inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. In a desperate bid to save himself from total destruction, Trent immediately did the only possible thing a coward cornered by the undeniable truth could ever do. He violently turned his back on the woman standing next to him. Trent threw his hands in the air, physically backing away from Monica, as if she were suddenly infected with a highly contagious, lethal disease. He looked directly at the lead federal investigator, his voice trembling with a sickening mixture of rising panic and eager, immediate compliance. He pointed his index finger directly at Monica's chest, his damning words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic stream of complete and utter betrayal. He loudly proclaimed that the entire corporate embezzlement scheme was completely her brilliant idea from the very beginning. He wildly swore that he was only following her executive directives, merely trying to manage the severe financial fallout of her reckless, unchecked corporate spending habits. But then he delivered the ultimate terrifying confession to the crowded room. He practically screamed that he had absolutely nothing to do with Colin's tragic death. He told the federal agents right in front of the entire stunned board of directors that she was the only one who actively swapped the pills. He confessed loudly that Monica had meticulously planned the fatal dosage, ordered the synthesized amphetamines, and personally handed Colin the lethal cocktail, successfully disguised as his blood pressure medication. He desperately offered to testify against her, fully, completely abandoning their lethal partnership to save his own miserable skin. Monica let out a guttural, wounded gasp as Trent's cowardly words echoed across the silent boardroom. The ultimate betrayal from her partner completely shattered her remaining composure. The lead federal agent gave a sharp, definitive nod to his team, and the three remaining agents instantly moved in with practiced, unyielding precision. They grabbed Trent first, forcing his arms behind his back without hesitation. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists with a loud, satisfying metallic finality. They informed him he was under immediate federal arrest for corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and accessory to first-degree murder. Two other agents flanked Monica on either side. She tried to pull away from them, her expensive designer suit twisting awkwardly as she thrashed against their iron, unforgiving grip. The heavy handcuffs secured her delicate wrists tightly, pinning her arms behind her back. The lead agent calmly recited her Miranda rights in a flat, monotonous voice that starkly contrasted with her rising, hysterical, deafening panic. The wealthy board members watched in absolute horrified silence as the reigning chief executive officer of a $50 million empire was physically restrained like a common, violent street criminal. The polished facade she had so carefully maintained for years was entirely gone, replaced by the ugly, chaotic reality of her monstrous greed. The federal agents began to pull them both toward the heavy oak doors, preparing to drag them through the crowded corporate lobby for the entire firm to witness their humiliating downfall. As the federal agents turned her toward the exit to begin her long, inevitable walk of shame, Monica dug the heels of her designer shoes into the polished hardwood floor, desperately fighting the forward momentum. She twisted her neck to look back at me one final agonized time, her flawless makeup now completely ruined by dark, running streams of mascara. Her cold, impenetrable arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, sobbing, desperate plea for mercy. She cried out my name, begging me to stop the armed federal agents, immediately insisting that she loved Colin, that it was a terrible misunderstanding, and that we could still quietly work this out as a proper, loving family. She wailed that I could not just let them take her away to a cold prison cell. I walked slowly around the edge of the large wooden table, stopping just a few inches away from her trembling, tightly handcuffed form. I looked down at the miserable woman who had smiled in my face while planning to bury my only son in the hard ground. I leaned in close to her ear, ensuring my tone was low, steady, and merciless. "You told me not to expect a penny of my son's money," I whispered, watching the final desperate spark of hope completely die in her eyes. "You were right. I didn't take a penny. I took it all back. Enjoy your 20 years in a cage." The swift and brutal collapse of Monica and Trent Harrison was a spectacle that dominated the Charlotte corporate news cycle for months. In the immediate aftermath of their highly publicized arrests, the fragile criminal alliance they had built rapidly disintegrated. Facing the undeniable weight of the decrypted offshore ledgers, the federal toxicology report, and my son's final video, they aggressively turned on one another like cornered animals. Trent desperately attempted to secure a plea deal by offering a comprehensive confession detailing how Monica had systematically researched, procured, and administered the lethal synthetic amphetamines. He provided the federal prosecutors with every single digital footprint, every deleted email, and every hidden routing number. Monica retaliated by unleashing a battery of expensive defense attorneys, attempting to paint herself as a terrified, abused wife manipulated by a predatory corporate executive. The federal judge saw straight through their pathetic, transparent lies. They were both denied bail deemed extreme flight risks due to the massive amounts of stolen capital still floating in the Cayman Islands. 6 months later, the prolonged legal battle finally concluded with absolute finality. They were convicted of international wire fraud, grand larceny, corporate espionage, and first-degree premeditated murder. They are currently locked away in separate maximum security federal penitentiaries, facing the inescapable reality of spending the rest of their natural lives rotting inside a concrete cage. I am currently sitting quietly behind the massive mahogany desk in the primary executive office, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the sprawling Charlotte skyline. This was Colin's sanctuary, the room where he spent countless sleepless nights building his logistics empire, and the exact room where he bravely recorded his dying declaration. Over the past 6 months, I have officially taken over the board of directors, stepping out of my quiet retirement to assume the mantle of Chief Executive Officer. My first administrative action was a ruthless, uncompromising purge of the entire corporate hierarchy. I systematically fired every executive director, financial auditor, and regional manager who had either actively facilitated Trent's embezzlement scheme or conveniently turned a blind eye to the irregularities. I completely dismantled the toxic corporate culture they had allowed to fester, replacing the complicit board members with seasoned, fiercely loyal industry veterans whom I had personally vetted. We worked tirelessly navigating the complex financial wreckage, recovering the stolen $15 million from the offshore accounts, and aggressively stabilizing the company's fragile market position. The logistics firm is now running with precise, clean efficiency, its foundation entirely secure. However, sitting in this luxurious office and controlling a massive $50 million empire brings me absolutely no personal joy. The vast wealth, the corporate prestige, and the immense industry power mean absolutely nothing to me without my son here to share them. I am an old man who is perfectly content living a quiet, simple life in my modest house, tending to my garden and enjoying my peaceful retirement. I only ever wanted my boy to be safe, and knowing his success made him a target is a heavy burden I will always carry. But I refuse to let Colin's brilliant legacy be defined by the horrifying tragedy of his death. I refuse to let the greed of 2 despicable parasites eclipse the incredible vision my son brought into this world. I reached across the wide mahogany desk and picked up my heavy gold-plated fountain pen. Resting in front of me is a thick stack of finalized legal documents, meticulously drafted by Thomas Mitchell and his team of corporate attorneys. With a steady hand, I signed the bottom of the final page, officially converting a substantial portion of the $50 million firm into a permanent, highly funded, philanthropic entity. I established the Colin Caldwell Incubator Foundation. This foundation is specifically designed to provide massive, unconditional financial grants, comprehensive structural resources, and elite legal protection to young technology engineers just starting out. I want to find the bright, ambitious kids who have incredible world-changing ideas but lack the immense capital to protect themselves from predatory corporate investors. I want to give them the exact kind of secure, impenetrable safety net that Colin had to fight so desperately hard to build on his own. The foundation will ensure that my son's name is forever synonymous with creation, innovation, and unwavering support, completely erasing the dark stain Monica and Trent tried to leave behind. His logistics firm will continue to thrive, generating the necessary annual revenue to fund the incubator indefinitely. Colin's incredible mind will continue to shape the future of this city long after I am gone, his legacy permanently secured against any future corruption or unmitigated greed. Later that afternoon, I left the busy corporate headquarters and drove out to the quiet, peaceful cemetery on the eastern edge of the city. The warm spring sun was shining brightly, casting long, gentle shadows across the meticulously manicured green lawns. The air smelled of fresh pine and blooming jasmine, a stark welcome contrast to the sterile, cold atmosphere of the federal courtrooms and corporate boardrooms I had inhabited for the past half-year. I walked slowly down the familiar winding stone path until I reached Colin's resting place. The dark granite headstone was simple, elegant, and strong, perfectly reflecting the man he had been. I stood there in the quiet solitude for a very long time, feeling the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves of the old oak trees. I absolutely did not cry. The tears had all been shed during those dark, terrifying nights when I first uncovered the staggering depth of their betrayal. Now I only felt a deep, profound sense of enduring peace. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out the heavy, unmarked brass key, the key that had unlocked the conquered vault, the key that had exposed the lethal prescription, the key that had ultimately saved his entire life's work. I knelt down slowly, my joints aching slightly with age, and carefully placed the cold brass key directly onto the smooth granite base of the headstone. I brushed a fallen leaf away from his engraved name, tracing the familiar letters with a steady hand. I spoke to him then, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying across the quiet lawns. I told him that the logistics firm was completely safe, that his incredible vision was fully protected, and that the monsters who had hurt him could never touch his legacy again. I stood back up, adjusting my suit jacket, and took one final look at his grave. The deep burden of grief and vengeance that had fueled me for the past 6 months slowly began to lift from my weary shoulders, replaced by a quiet, unbreakable pride. They saw a grieving father and assumed I was just a weak, clueless old man waiting to fade away. They mistook my retirement for a lack of strength. But they forgot one fundamental rule of nature. A wolf may grow old, his fur may turn gray, and he may prefer the peace of the den, but when you threaten his bloodline, you will quickly discover that his teeth are still razor-sharp, and his bite remains lethal. The deepest lesson from these stories is to never ignore your instincts when something feels wrong, especially when it involves the people you love most. Blind trust can sometimes create an opening for greed and selfishness, leading to heartbreaking consequences. However, no matter how cruel betrayal may be, the truth eventually finds its way to the surface. By staying clear-minded and having the courage to face reality, we can protect ourselves and move forward with strength. If you found this story meaningful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel today so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Have you ever experienced a similar situation? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you.